Welcome! This time on WoodWorks, we'll make this walnut occasional table with a striking veneered top. So please join us. Hi, I'm David Marks. Welcome to WoodWorks. This walnut and rosewood table features a magnificent veneered top. To make it, we'll use walnut burl and cut it into a 4-way book match pattern. This small but intricate piece of fine furniture has a flair of sophistication. With its solid walnut legs, they are nicely tapered and elegantly trimmed with Honduran rosewood beading. This striking tabletop is framed in rosewood and sits on a decorative apron. A stunning table for all occasions. We'll begin our project today with the legs. I've already milled up some stock, walnut, to 1 5/8 of an inch square, and I've cut it to length 19 inches. Let's take a look at our example. There's a few interesting design features of the legs to highlight. The legs are tapered on all 4 sides, 1 5/8 of an inch square at the top to 7/8 of an inch square at the bottom. And here are the decorative rosewood beadings. Before we cut the tapers, and while our legs are still square, let's cut the kerf for our beading. It would be a lot harder to cut them after our legs are tapered. We'll make these cuts here at the table saw. I've installed a crosscut sled and set up the stop block to ensure the accuracy of the cuts from leg to leg. We're set up to make our first cuts at the top of the leg. The kerfs we're making are 1/8 of an inch deep and 1/8 of an inch wide, the same width as the saw blade. Simply batch cut by rotating the leg stock, making the same cut on all 4 sides of the leg. To make the kerfs on the lower part of the legs, we adjust our stop block so the cuts will be exactly 2 inches from the bottom of the legs. To accommodate the taper of the leg, we raise our saw blade to 1/2 inch. Now we're ready to cut. We'll make 4 cuts on all of our legs. With all of our kerfs cut, let's start on our joinery. We'll be using loose mortise and tenons to attach our legs to our apron. Here's our example. We're going to be cutting a mortise that's 2 3/8 of an inch long by 1/4 of an inch wide by 3/4 of an inch deep. We'll make 2 mortise cuts in each leg. But before you do, take a good look at your stock and pick your 2 sides that you want to face out. Take a look at the grain and look for any flaws. Taking the time to study the wood and pick your 2 best sides will turn a good-looking table into a great-looking table. On the sides that will face inward, we make the mortises in the legs at the multi-router. We need 2 mortises in each leg. The settings are the same for each side, so all you have to do is rotate the stock. With our mortises cut, now we can taper the legs. We've built a tapering jig that will allow us to cut a taper 3/8 of an inch on all 4 sides of the leg. We've set our fence so that our cut will start just past this beading. Now obviously, we don't want to cut into the beading or the mortises. So we'll simply insert our leg into the jig and make our first 2 cuts. Always rotate the legs the same direction after every cut, and mark the legs as you go to help avoid confusion. After we taper 2 faces of the stock, we add a spacer. The spacer is 3/8 of an inch wide and makes up for what we've just cut away, keeping the leg properly positioned for the last 2 taper cuts. To smooth away the blade marks left by the tapering, we're using a hand scraper. Next, we'll add the decorative accents for our legs. Let's look at our example. The beading is made from Honduran rosewood. We've already milled some strips. They're 1/8 of an inch thick. From these, we'll cut the strips. They'll fit into our kerfs. And to save some time, we'll also cut the strips that will accent our aprons. First, with a bandsaw fence set 1/4 inch from the blade, we cut narrow strips of beading that will fit into the slots we cut on the legs. Then, we adjust the fence to 7/8 of an inch and cut the wider strips that will accent the aprons. Now that we have our strips of rosewood, we want to miter each edge of the beading for our legs. Now, as you can imagine, cutting them one at a time could take forever. So, we've cut them and taped 4 of them together. This way, we can make 4 miter cuts at once and save a lot of time. We adjust the stop block to cut the longer beading for the top of the legs, measuring 1 7/8 inches long. Using the stop block as a guide, we'll cut the miters in the rosewood beading that will accent the bottom of the legs. Each piece of the beading will be 1 1/4 inches long. Now we'll glue the beading into the legs. This is really a simple glue up. We just take a little bit of glue, apply it into the kerf, and then we'll take each piece of beading and take the miter and dip that into the small pool of glue and then slip that into the kerf. Press them into place, then line them up by hand. Then add a little masking tape to hold them all together. Set them aside and let the glue dry for an hour. Now we'll start on the aprons. Here's the stock for our aprons. It's solid black walnut that's been milled to 2 7/8 of an inch wide. We've left them a little bit long because we're going to be adding our rosewood accents, and then we'll cut them to final length. To attach the rosewood trim to the apron, we use yellow glue. By placing the inside edges of the trim and apron down on the assembly table, we ensure that the inside is flush and the outside of the trim sits proud. And here's a clamping tip to save time with the glue up. Position the aprons so the rosewood trim faces each other and clamp 2 aprons together using blocks to protect the wood. When the glue is dry, we trim the aprons to final length at the table saw. Then, at the multi-router, we make mortises in each end of our aprons to match the mortises we cut earlier in the legs. Make sure the proud side of the trim faces up so the apron sits flush on the multi-router table. To finish the joinery, we made some tenons. This is walnut that's been milled to a 1/4 inch thickness. We've rounded the edges so they'll fit snugly into our mortises. Now let's take a look and see how our legs and apron line up. As you can see, we need to make a little bit of an adjustment. We need to notch away a little of the beading right here on the end of the apron to make room for the beading on the legs. We need to measure the beading on the leg and mark how much to notch. Make the cuts on the table saw, then carefully chisel the edges square. Because our beading may be a little bit different on each piece, you want to lay out your pieces and label them, A to A, B to B, etc. That way, you'll make sure you don't have any gaps in your joints. As always, we'll double check our fit, and then we'll glue our base together. To ensure a strong bond, make sure to brush yellow glue into the mortises. And add some to your tenons. To get a tight fit, use 4 clamps. A shim will compensate for the offset apron and make it easier to check for square. While our base dries, we'll start on our tabletop. For it, we're going to cut some walnut burl veneer. Let me tell you a little bit about burls. Burls are perhaps the most unusual and mysterious material in the woodworker's realm. Basically, burls are an irregular growth on the tree caused by a fungal or bacterial irritation of the cambium, or when frost or something hitting the tree injures the cambium, which is the growth layer near the bark, resulting and some fantastic swirling grain patterns in the wood. To select the piece we'll cut for our veneers, let me show you a really cool trick. Take a couple of mirrors, taped together at 90 degrees, and position them across the burl until you find the pattern that you like. It has sort of a kaleidoscope effect, and it really shows how the four-way book match pattern will look. Once we have selected the pattern for our tabletop, we cut the walnut burl. Then we run the face of the burl slab over the knives of the jointer to get it flat. Referencing the flat face against the fence of the jointer, we now joint the sides to get a 90-degree edge. Now, we're ready to cut the veneer slices. But first, we draw a triangle on the edge of the burl slab for reference, because it's important to keep the veneers in the order we cut them. We cut 4 thin slices, each of them 1/16 of an inch thick, at the bandsaw. Next, we run each of the 4 veneer slices through the drum sander to sand them to a uniform thickness, and to remove any rough spots left by the bandsaw blade. Then we joint all the edges flat on the 6-inch jointer. Now let's see how they look. To get a 4-way book match pattern, you keep the veneer in the order that it was cut, then you simply fold them open, lay it down, and flip them over. Wow, that is a spectacular pattern. After you've positioned the pieces, take a piece of chalk and mark them with a triangle, and that way you'll make sure that the pieces will always get laid out the same way. Gluing veneers requires some care because the stock is very thin. So we're going to glue these in 3 stages. First, we'll glue this pair together. Then, we'll glue this pair together. Now, once the glue is dried, we'll make a very fine trim cut along this edge and then along this edge. Then, we'll glue these last 2 pairs together. We use yellow glue and carefully brush it on evenly. It's a good idea to use tape and clamps to pull them together, and then use bricks to keep the veneers flat while they dry. With our veneers trimmed, we're ready to glue them to our substrate. We're going to be using a piece of 3/4-inch apple plywood for our substrate. Now, one of the basic rules of veneering is that you need to veneer both sides to maintain equilibrium and also to prevent the plywood from warping. Now, on the back side, you don't need to use a piece of exotic burl. We're just going to use a piece of straight grain black walnut. To cut our veneer top to proper size at the table saw, we first make sure the joint lines are centered. Lay a plywood caul and some bricks on top to add weight, since the veneer is thin and we want to prevent it from chipping. Then make the cut. Now we're ready to glue up the tabletop. Use a liberal amount of yellow glue and apply it evenly to the plywood substrate and the walnut veneer that will attach to the underside. Place them both together. Then apply glue to the veneer top and stack it all together to make a wood and glue sandwich. We tape the sides together to prevent the veneer from slipping. We then place our tabletop into the bag of our vacuum press, setting it face down. Before we seal it, we place a solid piece of MDF on top to act as a caul. Then we turn on the vacuum pump and let it bond for a few hours. When the air gets pulled out of the vacuum press, it forces over 1,500 pounds of pressure per square foot onto the wooden glue sandwich. While our top is under pressure, we're going to make the rosewood trim that will frame our veneered tabletop. We've already milled some rosewood to size. Let's take a look at our example. We're going to use the router table to cut a dado into the sides, and that will create the appearance of 2 decorative beads. Then we'll use the miter jig at the table saw and make a 45-degree miter cut on all 4 corners of our frame. With a fence set 1/8 of an inch from the router bit, we'll make 2 passes at the router table to make our dado. It's a wise idea to use fingerboards when cutting wood as dense as our rosewood trim. The first pass will leave us with a decorative bead on one side. Next, We flip the stock and make a second pass, leaving us with a decorative bead on the other side. Don't forget to clean up the dado with some 220 grit sandpaper. Next, using the miter jig, we cut 45-degree miters on both ends of the trim. We've trimmed our veneer top to size, and now we're gluing on our rosewood trim. Be very careful to make sure that you clamp the trim so it's flush with the top. Now we're ready to attach the top to our base. When you attach tops to tables, you have to consider the movement of the wood. Wood is a dynamic material, and it will expand or contract depending upon the moisture in the environment. Generally, we use hardware like figure eights to deal with that movement. In the case of this table, with a veneer top, we have a simple solution. We'll glue it, because once the veneer is glued to the plywood, it will not move. Plywood won't react to moisture the way that solid wood does, and is considered to be a stable substrate. We apply yellow glue to the bottom of the tabletop and the apron surfaces. Then secure it with many clamps to get even downward pressure, and let our table cure for a few hours. For the finish, we're using a blend of linseed oil, tung oil, and polyurethane. This finish really soaks deeply into the wood and brings out the depth and beauty of the grain. It's also going to darken the wood, so if you prefer a lighter finish, try something like shellac or lacquer. The beautiful veneers that create the four-way book match top are the centerpiece of this elegant table. Surrounded by rosewood trim, the veneer top is really a work of art. The graceful tapered legs with beaded accents add to the overall elegance of this classically styled occasional table. Now, if you don't want to use walnut burl, you have a number of different options. You could use maple burl or oak burl and dye it, or you could use other burls like a madrone or a myrtle. Either way, as a design guideline, you should always try to match the color of your legs and your apron to the color of the veneer on the top. I'm David Marks. We'll see you next time on WoodWorks.